You're not losing her because of your age. That's the part most men never question. They assume the number is the problem, and that belief quietly shapes every move they make after. But let me ask you something uncomfortable. Have you noticed how some older men date younger women effortlessly, while others feel like they're constantly one wrong sentence away from watching her pull back? Same age gap, completely different outcome. That's not coincidence. That's awareness. And if you're here, it's because somewhere deep down you felt it. That moment when her tone shifts, when her excitement softens, when something you meant well didn't land the way you expected. You didn't do anything wrong. You were operating without the full picture. Men who notice patterns instead of defending themselves. Men who feel the shift before it's explained to them. Those men don't chase, they adjust. I'm Amelia, and this isn't about impressing a younger woman. It's about understanding why certain behaviors quietly push her away, often without a single argument, without a clear reason, without closure. Let's begin where most men don't even realize the damage starts. Being technologically disconnected, not ignorant, disconnected. There's a difference, and she feels it immediately. This isn't about knowing every app, trend, or update. No one expects you to be a tech prodigy, but when you dismiss technology, mock it, or treat it like a nuisance instead of a tool, what she hears is something deeper. Your world doesn't matter to me. And here's the part most men miss. Technology isn't just convenience to her. It's how she communicates, explores, organizes, flirts, learns, connects. So, when you roll your eyes at a new app or refuse to engage with something that clearly excites her, you're not rejecting technology. You're rejecting access to her inner world. Men who stay rigid often think this makes them grounded, stable, unshaken by trends. But to her, rigidity reads as distance. The moment you say, "I don't need that stuff," you subtly place yourself outside her reality. And she doesn't argue. She simply stops inviting you in. Here's the quiet shift most men never notice. When you ask her to show you something, not because you need it, but because you're curious, you reverse the power dynamic. You're not chasing relevance. You're demonstrating openness. Curiosity signals confidence. Disdain signals fear of change. And fear is what makes attraction quietly erode. But this is only the surface. Because even men who keep up still make another mistake. One that feels harmless, but visually amplifies the age gap in ways words never could. We'll go there next, only if you're ready to see it. There's a moment, subtle, almost invisible, when she looks at you and calculates something she never planned to. Not your age, your awareness, and that moment often arrives before you even speak, dressing inappropriately in either direction. Most men think this is about clothes. It isn't. It's about signal alignment. Here's the trap. Some older men try to dress younger to keep up. Others cling tightly to the style that once made them feel powerful. Both mistakes come from the same place, uncertainty about where they belong now, and women feel that immediately. Leaning too hard into youthful trends doesn't make you look modern. It makes you look like you're asking permission to stay relevant. On the other side, staying frozen in the past doesn't make you classic. It quietly announces resistance, not taste. What she's reacting to isn't the jacket or the shoes or the decade they came from. She's reacting to whether you look settled in yourself. Men who are comfortable in their identity don't costume themselves. They curate. There's a calm authority in someone who dresses current without chasing, who updates without erasing himself, who looks like he belongs exactly where he is in life. And here's the psychological twist most men miss. When your appearance feels confused, she subconsciously wonders if your role is confused too. Are you trying to be her peer, her guide, her exception? She won't ask. She'll just feel a faint imbalance. And attraction hates imbalance. This isn't about impressing her. It's about not forcing her to reconcile contradictions. Because once she starts mentally managing the age gap for you, once she has to make sense of it, something important shifts, which brings us to the next mistake. One that sounds innocent, even honest, but slowly drains tension, mystery, and polarity from the connection. And most men don't realize they're doing it until she's already disengaging. There's a sentence older men repeat without realizing it's costing them attraction. Sometimes it sounds like a joke, sometimes like self-awareness, sometimes like honesty, but every time it lands the same way. Constantly talking about age. You mention it first, not her, and that matters more than you think. Older men often believe acknowledging the age gap shows confidence, that it removes tension, that it proves you're not insecure about it. But psychologically, it does the opposite. Every time you bring it up, your age, her youth, the difference between you, you're teaching her where to focus. And once attention goes there, it's hard to pull it back. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The age gap might have caught her curiosity, but it's never what sustains desire. What sustains it is presence, shared rhythm, emotional alignment. When you keep referencing the gap, you subtly frame yourself as an exception she has to justify instead of a man she simply chooses. Men who feel the need to explain themselves often don't realize they're explaining too much. An explanation kills tension. You don't need to remind her you're older. She already knows. What she's watching for is whether you're still alive in the moment or quietly living as an observer of her youth. And here's the deeper layer most men miss. When you joke about being old compared to her, you're placing yourself in a diminished position. Even if you laugh while doing it, she doesn't feel reassured. She feels subtly responsible, responsible for your insecurity, responsible for the gap, responsible for keeping things light. Attraction doesn't thrive on responsibility. It thrives on mutual presence. This is where many men unintentionally slide into the next mistake, one that feels protective, even caring, but slowly shifts the relationship out of romance and into something else entirely. And once that shift happens, it's very hard to reverse. There's a fine line that older men cross without ever realizing it, and the moment they do, the dynamic changes quietly, permanently. Being overly protective, it often starts with good intentions. You want to help, you want to guide, you want to make sure she's safe, supported, prepared, but protection turns toxic the moment it replaces respect. Here's what happens beneath the surface. When you step in too quickly, when you correct before she asks, when you assume she needs shielding instead of partnership, you unintentionally communicate this. I don't fully trust your judgment. And nothing shuts down attraction faster than being underestimated. You see, she didn't arrive at her life by accident. She's made choices, taken risks, learned lessons long before you appeared. So when you override her autonomy in the name of care, she doesn't feel cherished, she feels managed. Men who confuse leadership with control often don't notice the shift, but she does. She starts filtering what she shares, not because she's hiding, but because she doesn't want to be corrected, warned, or redirected. And here's the psychological twist. The more you try to protect her, the less safe she feels expressing herself around you, because safety isn't about being guarded, it's about being trusted. This is where many older men unknowingly step into a role she never asked for. Not a lover, not an equal, but something closer to a guardian. And guardians don't get chosen romantically for long. But there's another mistake that often follows this one. Subtle, easy to justify, and devastating over time. It has nothing to do with control and everything to do with comfort. Comfort is dangerous when it goes unquestioned, especially for men who've already lived a lot of life. Avoiding new experiences. You tell yourself you've already done it all. The trips, the scenes, the late nights, the experiments. And maybe that's true. But here's what quietly changes the dynamic. When you stop exploring, she starts exploring without you, mentally first, emotionally next. This isn't about adrenaline or novelty for novelty's sake. It's about shared momentum. You might see a new experience and think, I've already been there. She sees the same moment and thinks, I want to experience this version of myself. And when you decline too often, not forcefully, not dramatically, just with a calm disinterest, You send a message you never intended. I'm finished becoming. Men who believe they're done evolving don't notice the slow shift, but women do. Because youth isn't just energy, it's openness. And when she feels like she's the only one bringing curiosity into the relationship, the imbalance grows. Here's the perspective shift most men miss. It's not that she needs constant stimulation. She needs to feel like the future still excites you. Not recklessly, not desperately, but willingly. When you say yes occasionally to a new place, a new idea, a new rhythm, you're not proving you're young. You're proving you're present. And presence is magnetic. But there's another behavior that quietly drains presence, even faster than routine. It happens in conversation, casually, often without intention. And once she notices it, she starts questioning whether she truly has her own space with you at all. There's a moment in conversation when her energy drops, not suddenly, but noticeably. Most men miss it. Oversharing, past relationships. You think you're just being open, honest, transparent, experienced, but to her, something else is happening. Every time an ex becomes a reference point, a comparison, a story, a lesson, the present moment loses oxygen. Here's the psychological truth. No woman wants to feel like she's auditioning for a role that's already been played. When you bring past partners into the room too often, you unintentionally split your attention between what was and what is. And she feels that division. Men who are truly settled in themselves don't need to narrate their history. They let it inform them quietly, because experience only feels attractive when it's integrated, not displayed. There's another layer here that's uncomfortable to admit. When you frequently reference past relationships, she doesn't hear maturity. She wonders whether you've emotionally closed those chapters or whether they're still open in ways you haven't acknowledged. And uncertainty kills safety. It makes her hesitate, pull back, stay slightly guarded, not because she's insecure, but because she's perceptive. She wants to feel like the center of your attention now, not a continuation, not a replacement, not a footnote in a long story. And here's the shift men don't expect. The less you speak about the past, the more weight the present carries. Silence, used correctly, creates space for intimacy, but oversharing often comes paired with another mistake, one that sounds responsible, even impressive, yet subtly reframes the entire relationship into something transactional. And once that frame sets in, romance struggles to breathe. There's a shift that happens when admiration turns into evaluation, and most men don't feel it until it's already cost them something. Overemphasis on financial stability. You're proud of what you've built. You should be. Stability, discipline, provision, these matter. But here's the psychological line that's easy to cross without noticing. When your value is communicated primarily through what you provide, you quietly move out of the role of romantic partner and into the role of utility. You don't say it directly. You don't need to. It happens through tone, through repetition, through the subtle framing of conversations. When finances become the anchor of your identity in the relationship, she stops relating to you emotionally and starts assessing you functionally. And attraction does not live there. Here's the uncomfortable realization most men resist. Younger women are not drawn to money the way men fear they are. They're drawn to emotional presence paired with competence. When you lead with stability too often, you imply that something else might be missing. And she feels that imbalance. Men who rely on financial security as their main signal often don't realize they're doing it out of self-protection. It feels safer to be respected for what you've achieved than to be felt for who you are. But intimacy requires being experienced, not assessed. She doesn't want to feel like a business partner or an investment decision or someone who owes gratitude. She wants to feel chosen freely. And when money becomes too loud in the room, desire gets quiet. This naturally bleeds into another behavior, one that seems harmless, even opinionated, but subtly positions you as out of sync with her emotional world. And once that gap opens, it's felt in places words can't repair. There's a moment when she shares something she loves and watches your reaction more closely than your words, criticizing modern music and movies. You don't mean to dismiss it. You're just stating an opinion, a preference, a comparison. But when you brush off the music she plays or mock the shows and films that move her, you're not debating taste. You're questioning meaning. Here's what's really happening psychologically. Those songs aren't just noise to her. Those movies aren't just entertainment. They're emotional landmarks. They're tied to friendships, phases, memories, identity. So when you label them shallow, inferior, or forgettable, she doesn't feel challenged. She feels unseen. Men who default to things were better back then often don't realize what they're signaling. Not wisdom, not refinement, but emotional closure. It tells her your inner world is sealed, already complete, with no curiosity left for hers. And curiosity is one of the strongest forms of respect. Here's the reframe that changes everything. You don't have to like what she likes, but you do have to honor what it represents. When you ask why a song matters to her, when you let her explain what a show makes her feel, when you share your favorites without diminishing hers, you're not bridging a generation. You're building emotional exchange. And emotional exchange creates safety. But this mistake often pairs with another one: less visible, more physical, and quietly decisive. Because attraction isn't just mental, it's energetic. And when energy drops, she feels it before you do. Energy doesn't announce when it's leaving. It fades. And by the time most men notice, she's already adjusting her expectations, ignoring health and fitness. This isn't about looking young, and it's definitely not about chasing aesthetics. It's about alignment. Younger women often live in motion, physically, mentally, emotionally. They walk faster, plan faster, recover faster. When you neglect your health, what she senses isn't age, it's inertia. Here's the part most men misunderstand. She's not judging your body, she's reading your relationship with yourself. When you dismiss fitness, energy, or basic health routines, it subtly signals resignation, as if you've accepted a slow narrowing of life, and that creates tension, not attraction, because she's still expanding. Men who value longevity over vanity carry a different presence. Not frantic, not insecure, but intentional. Even small efforts, walking, stretching, moving with purpose, communicate something powerful. I plan to be here fully, and that matters more than you think. There's also a deeper layer most men don't consider. Health is future-oriented. When you ignore it, she subconsciously questions how much future you're actually inviting her into. Not because she's calculating years, but because she's sensing trajectory. And attraction follows trajectory. But even men who stay active can sabotage everything with one quiet behavior. One that cuts deeper than neglect ever could because it doesn't attack your body. It attacks her sense of being seen. There's a moment when she stops sharing her thoughts freely. Not because she has nothing to say, but because she's learned how it will land. Undervaluing her opinions. It doesn't always sound like dismissal. Sometimes it's a pause, a correction, a subtle reframe. You think you're adding perspective. She feels reduced. Here's the psychological reality. Age gives experience, not automatic authority. When you treat her ideas as naive, incomplete, or less informed, even unintentionally, you create a hierarchy she never agreed to. And attraction doesn't survive hierarchy. Men who believe they're just being realistic often don't notice how often they override instead of engage. But she notices every time her thought is met with instruction instead of curiosity, she learns to hold back. And when a woman stops offering her inner world, the relationship becomes quieter, but not calmer, less expressive, less alive. Here's the reframe that shifts everything. You don't have to agree with her to honor her. Listening without correcting signals strength. Inviting her reasoning instead of replacing it signals respect. And respect is a prerequisite for desire, especially when there's an age gap because she already knows you've lived longer. What she's watching for is whether you still believe she has something to teach you. But even men who listen well can quietly undo that progress with another deeply ingrained habit, one that feels stable, predictable, safe until it isn't. There's a comfort that slowly turns into confinement, and most men don't feel it. They are it, being set in your ways. Routines can feel earned. They bring order, efficiency, predictability. But when routine hardens into rigidity, it stops being grounding and starts being limiting. Here's what happens beneath the surface. When every suggestion meets resistance, when spontaneity feels inconvenient, when change is tolerated rather than welcomed, she doesn't feel partnered. She feels absorbed into your life instead of building a shared one. Men who are deeply set in their ways often believe they're offering stability, but stability without flexibility feels like a closed system, and closed systems don't invite curiosity, they shut it down. You see, younger women don't just bring novelty, they bring movement, new perspectives, different rhythms, unexpected ideas. When those are constantly filtered through, "That's not how I do things," she starts shrinking herself to fit, and attraction fades when expansion is replaced by adaptation. Here's the quiet psychological shift. The more you resist change, the more she becomes the only one adapting. And imbalance breeds distance. You don't need to abandon who you are, but you do need to remain porous, open to influence, open to adjustment, open to being shaped slightly by someone you care about. Because real confidence isn't fixed, it's responsive. But there's another mistake that often hides behind routine, one that feels noble, even protective, yet completely mislabels the role she's asking you to play. There's a moment when guidance turns into gravity, and she starts to feel pulled downward instead of forward, mistaking parenting for partnership. You think you're helping her avoid mistakes, sharing wisdom, offering perspective, preventing unnecessary pain. But here's the psychological line that changes everything. She's not looking for supervision, she's looking for alignment. When your default position becomes advisor instead of equal, the relationship shifts out of romance and into hierarchy, and hierarchy kills desire. Men who step into a parental role rarely do it consciously. It comes from care, from experience, from the instinct to protect. But intention doesn't change impact. Every time you lecture instead of listen, correct instead of collaborate, decide instead of discuss, you quietly communicate, "I'm above you." And no woman stays romantically engaged where she feels positioned beneath. Here's the realization most men resist. Being needed is not the same as being wanted. Parenting creates dependence. Partnership creates choice. She wants to choose you, not rely on you. Support when asked builds trust. Control, even disguised as wisdom, erodes it. This is where many older men lose polarity without noticing. They become safe, predictable, reliable, and strangely less desired. But there's another mistake that often follows this one. Less visible, but emotionally devastating. Because it doesn't just misread her role, it misjudges her future. There's a moment when she realizes you don't see her forward, only where she is now. And that realization changes how safe she feels with you, dismissing her ambitions. It's rarely said directly, it comes out as practicality, caution, realism. You question the timeline, the feasibility, the payoff. You think you're grounding her. She feels downsized. Here's the psychological truth most men miss. Ambition isn't just about outcomes. It's about identity and motion. Younger women often define themselves by what they're becoming, not just what they've achieved. So, when you minimize her goals, even subtly, you're not critiquing a plan. You're challenging her self-concept. Men who've already arrived sometimes forget this. They see dreams as risks to manage. She sees them as energy to channel. And when that energy meets doubt instead of belief, something closes. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. She stops sharing big ideas, stops dreaming out loud, stops inviting you into her future because the future to her feels safer when it's not questioned. Here's the reframe that restores polarity. You don't have to agree with her vision to respect it. Support doesn't mean blind encouragement. It means curiosity before caution. When you ask why a goal matters to her before explaining how it might fail, you become an ally instead of an obstacle. And allies are chosen repeatedly. But even men who support ambition can unintentionally undermine connection with something as simple and overlooked as the words they use. Language matters more than most men realize. Language is one of the fastest ways to reveal whether you're evolving or standing still, and she hears it long before you notice it. Overusing old slang. You don't think about it. These are just the words you grew up with, the phrases that feel natural, familiar. But here's what's happening underneath the surface. Language signals where you live mentally. When your speech is anchored too tightly to another era, it subtly reinforces the age gap, even when everything else feels aligned. This isn't about sounding young, it's about sounding present. Overusing outdated slang can make conversations feel disjointed. Not wrong, just slightly off rhythm, and rhythm matters more than content. Men who assume language is trivial often miss this. Communication isn't just meaning, it's flow. When she has to translate, adjust, or mentally bridge gaps just to stay connected, she feels friction, and attraction avoids friction. Here's the psychological shift that changes everything. You don't need to abandon your language, you need to expand it. When you're open to learning how she expresses herself, new phrases, new humor, new references, you signal adaptability, not insecurity, not desperation. Adaptability is confidence that isn't threatened by change. And when you occasionally share your expressions too without forcing them, you create exchange instead of imbalance. That's how generational gaps close. But even men who communicate well often stumble on the next mistake, one that has nothing to do with words and everything. To do with interest. Because when interest is absent, everything else stops mattering. Interest isn't proven by agreement. It's proven by engagement. And this is where many men unknowingly disengage first, refusing to engage in her interests. You don't have to love everything she loves. That's not the issue. The issue is what happens when you don't enter her world at all. When she talks about a new hobby, a trending show, a strange interest you don't fully understand, and your response is distance instead of curiosity. She feels it immediately. Men often think enthusiasm must be authentic to be valid, so they choose indifference over effort. But indifference sends a message far louder than disagreement. What excites you doesn't matter to me, and here's the part that cuts deeper. She's not testing your tastes, she's testing your willingness to step toward her. Men who stay anchored only in their own interests often believe they're being authentic. But authenticity without curiosity becomes isolation. Relationships don't thrive on shared preferences alone. They thrive on shared attention. When you refuse to engage, even lightly, she stops inviting you, first into her interests, then into her thoughts, then into her inner life. And that withdrawal doesn't feel dramatic. It feels quiet, polite, inevitable. Here's the reframe that restores connection. You don't have to master her interests. You only have to respect the energy behind them. Trying once, asking questions, showing up imperfectly. That effort signals something powerful. You matter enough for me to step outside myself. And that is deeply attractive. But even when interest is present, many men sabotage intimacy in a far more private way. One rooted not in dismissal, but in insecurity. And this one changes everything about how she touches you. There's a silence that forms before distance ever does. It happens in the body first. Overthinking physical intimacy. You become careful, measured, self-aware. You start monitoring yourself instead of feeling the moment, and she senses the shift instantly. Here's what most men don't realize. Self-consciousness doesn't register as humility. It registers as disconnection. When you overfocus on physical differences, on performance, on how age might be perceived, you remove yourself from presence. And intimacy requires presence more than perfection. She didn't choose you despite your body. She chose you with it. Attraction isn't fragile. Insecurity is. Men who overthink intimacy often believe they're being respectful, gentle, considerate. But what she feels is hesitation, and hesitation disrupts polarity. Here's the psychological truth that reframes everything. Confidence isn't loud. It's relaxed when you stop evaluating yourself mid-connection. You allow energy to flow naturally. Touch becomes mutual instead of monitored. Desire becomes shared instead of negotiated. And here's the part most men miss. She's not comparing you to younger men. She's responding to how comfortable you are being desired. When you accept attraction instead of questioning it, intimacy deepens. But even men who regain physical confidence can quietly sabotage emotional closeness with one deeply human habit, one that feels nostalgic, harmless, even charming until it isn't. Nostalgia feels warm, safe, familiar, but too much of it turns the present cold. Constant nostalgia. Sharing memories isn't the problem. Living in them is. When stories of the past become the main reference point, the good old days, how things used to be, she starts to feel like a visitor in your life, not a participant. Here's what's happening psychologically. Every time you anchor conversation backward, you pull emotional gravity away from now. And attraction lives in the present. Men who lean heavily on nostalgia often don't realize what they're signaling, not wisdom, but completion, as if the most meaningful chapters are already written, and that creates distance because she's still writing hers. You don't need to erase your history, but you do need to balance it. Memories should add depth, not replace momentum. When the past dominates, the future feels underdeveloped and women are deeply attuned to future energy. Here's the reframe that restores polarity. Stories are bridges, not destinations. Share them, then return to now. Create memories with her instead of reliving ones she wasn't part of. That's how she feels integrated, not adjacent. But even when the present feels strong, many men unknowingly weaken connection by avoiding something that matters deeply to her identity. Not her hobbies, not her dreams, her people. There's a quiet test she never announces. You either step into it or you slowly step out of her life, avoiding her friends. You don't say you dislike them, you just stay distant, unavailable, uninterested. And to you, it feels neutral. To her, it feels telling. Here's the psychological layer most men miss. Friends are witnesses. They see her patterns, her moods, her values. So when you avoid them, you're not just avoiding social effort, you're avoiding integration. Men often believe the relationship exists in a private bubble, that what happens between the two of you is all that matters. But to her, connection is contextual. When you resist stepping into her social world, she feels like she's living two lives. And people don't stay long in divided realities. She doesn't need you to impress her friends. She needs you to acknowledge their importance because when you show curiosity about the people who matter to her, you show respect for her emotional ecosystem. And respect deepens attachment. Here's the uncomfortable realization. Avoidance looks like detachment, even when it isn't meant that way. She starts wondering if you're only interested in her attention, not her life. And that thought changes how safe she feels investing further. But there's another behavior that often appears alongside avoidance, one driven not by distance, but by fear, and it reveals itself in moments when you feel most vulnerable. Jealousy doesn't start loud. It starts as vigilance, showing jealousy. You notice the looks, the conversations, the ease she has around younger men, and something tightens. You tell yourself it's natural, protective, reasonable. But here's what she feels instead: mistrust. Not because you accuse her, but because your energy changes. Questions linger too long. Reassurance is subtly required. Your mood shifts based on who enters the room. Men often believe jealousy proves investment. Psychologically, it signals fear of replacement. And fear reverses polarity. She didn't choose you because you were the safest option in the room. She chose you because you felt grounded. When jealousy shows up repeatedly, she doesn't feel cherished. She feels monitored. And monitoring makes people self-conscious, not loyal. Here's the part most men don't want to hear. Confidence isn't pretending other men don't exist. It's trusting your position without guarding it. When you react every time she interacts with someone younger, you unintentionally highlight the age gap not in your favor. You remind her of something she wasn't focused on. And attraction doesn't survive being reminded. The reframe that restores power is simple but not easy. Trust is attractive. Not blind trust, not naive trust, but calm trust. When you communicate feelings without accusation, when you don't require constant reassurance, when you let her choose you daily without pressure, you shift from insecurity to quiet authority. And quiet authority is magnetic. But there is one final mistake. The most subtle of all, because it doesn't show up in actions. It shows up in outlook. And once she feels it, she starts planning emotionally without you. There's a tone she listens for beneath everything you say. Not optimism, not excitement, direction, being pessimistic about the future. You don't think of yourself as negative, just realistic, cautious, aware of how the world works. But here's what she feels instead. Contraction, when your language leans toward decline, when the future is framed as something to endure rather than explore, when change is spoken about with resignation instead of curiosity, she doesn't feel protected by your wisdom. She feels slowed by it. Younger women live forward, not recklessly, but expectantly. They don't need blind hope. They need shared momentum. Men who constantly brace for what's coming often believe they're being responsible. But responsibility without vision feels heavy, and heaviness erodes desire. Here's the realization that reframes everything. Your experience is meant to steady the future, not darken it. When your outlook combines realism with openness, when caution is balanced with belief, when you acknowledge challenges without surrendering possibility, you become something rare. Not a man stuck in the past, not a man afraid of the future, but a man rooted in the present, capable of walking forward with clarity. And this is where everything comes together. You were never being rejected for your age, you were being tested for awareness. Once you see these patterns, you stop explaining yourself, stop compensating, stop trying to manage perception. You move differently, calmer, more grounded, more deliberate. And that shift, that quiet internal clarity is what younger women respond to most, not because it's impressive, but because it's real. Music.